what is happening in Syria is concerning, interesting, dynamic, and it is certainly dramatic because over the last 24 hours, over the last 11, 12 days really, it has been very, very unstable, and now President Assad is on his way out of the country on a plane. We don't know where. There are rumours his family is in Russia. Russia has, of course, supported his murderous, tyrannical, horrific regime. There are quite a few stories around today on the foreign affairs side, not just Syria, but also yesterday in France, Zelensky and Trump talking about a war, possible end to the war in Ukraine. No better person to guide us through all this than Mary Dejevsky, who is a foreign affairs columnist at the Independent. Mary, what is your reaction?
Hello.
Hello there. Busy old couple of days. What is your reaction to what's happening in Syria?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, so fast. You would never absolutely have imagined, you know, the day when it was said that rebels had sort of broken out and crossed into Syria and were taking towns. I mean, you sort of couldn't imagine that in less than 2 weeks they would have taken Damascus and that Assad would have fled. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary, and it changes so much.
It certainly does. What does it change? Just for a lot of our viewers and listeners, and me actually, coming to the story pretty cold, knowing a little bit about Syria, knowing that Bashar al-Assad isn't a nice person, but actually the people replacing him, many of them are, well, one of the main organisations is a proscribed terrorist organisation. What are your, given, I mean, it's a dynamic situation, it's moving all the time, but what are your thoughts on whether life will actually end up being better for people in Syria or worse? What do you think?
Well, I think that's absolutely a crucial question because, you know, the mood generally outside Syria and to an extent in Syria has been absolute jubilation, has said, you know, you've got rid of a dictator, you've got rid of a repressive system. This is what was tried at the beginning of the Arab Spring that gave rise to the civil war. And now this has actually happened. You've got people on the streets rejoicing, and you've got a general mood of optimism and goodbye to Assad in the West. Now, I think that that is really quite a dangerous response because, as you point out, we don't actually know who is going to take over, if anybody, and if they can control the country, if they can actually bring stability to Syria. And if the people who are going to bring stability, or at least partial stability, are an organisation which is proscribed as a terrorist organisation, as an Islamic fundamentalist organisation in other parts of the world, what does that say about the future for Syria? I mean, I don't think it's at all necessarily good news.
What about this report anyway? Reuters news agency has been told by 2 security sources that explosions have been heard in Damascus, a suspected Israeli strike. Why would they be striking now necessarily?
Well, that is also a very, very good question because what the downfall of Assad means for Israel is also, you know, that is a fascinating question because on the one hand, Syria was a big enemy for Israel. On the other hand, they had reached a sort of way of getting along with Assad in the sense that Syria was stable and to a large extent under control. And because it had been so weakened by the civil war, it was no threat anymore to Israel. So there may be some rather clumsy but obvious messages being sent here, if that is what's happening with the Israeli strike on Damascus.
A sort of warning, don't mess with us.
Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. What do you make, what does this mean for Russia? What does this mean for Iran?
Well, what it means for Iran...
Easy questions today, Mary.
What it means for Iran is that it just demonstrates how much weaker Iran is now than it was even a year ago, even as the Syrian civil war came to an end. So I think that's, you know, that is one very obvious conclusion. It says the same thing in a way about Russia. I mean, we've yet to see exactly how Russia is going to respond. I mean, is it going to reach some sort of deal with whoever takes over? Is it going to be able to keep its 2 bases, an air base and a naval base in Syria? If there's a choice between where it puts its troops, whether it puts its troops in Syria or whether it puts them in and around Ukraine, I mean, Russia may have to choose. But I mean, my view is that Russia would probably plump for Ukraine as the priority any time. But there's another very, very interesting aspect which I think needs to be watched. Through the Arab Spring, as we called it, Russia was very, very wary. And it wasn't immediately clear to me why this was. You know, we're talking, 12, 13 years ago. But it was explained to me that this was because the series of spontaneous and in some places successful uprisings actually could be seen as a sort of message to Russians that these things were possible, that it wasn't, that you didn't absolutely have to stick with a regime that you weren't necessarily happy with, that there was something like people power. Now, obviously, the Arab Spring sort of fizzled out, but I think that the downfall of Assad may have more direct and really worrying implications for Putin than may be seen at the moment.
Very, very interesting. We will watch and continue to keep you updated here on Talk on all of that. But I want to ask Mary now just about what has happened. Believe it or not, I mean, we've just been talking about what's happened really in the last 12 hours. Let's talk about the last 24 hours, which is something entirely different, and that is Zelensky talking to Trump, and that, of course, happened in Notre Dame Cathedral, beautiful big cathedral restored after the horrendous fire that happened 5 years ago. Guess what? You can do these massive public works projects and they can actually happen. But aside from that, it allowed a lot of big international figures, including President-elect Trump, as he is, former president and to be the next president, Zelensky, as well as their president of Ukraine. They have been talking about how war ends in Ukraine and actually face-to-face having those discussions. Mary, what do you read into this?
Well, I think one thing to be pointed out is that we're now sort of talking about the possibility of ending this war and bringing some sort of peace, as though this was the most normal thing in the world. I mean, you know, even 2 months ago, the idea that the war would actually stop at some point, and that indeed continuing the war was in Zelensky's interests and in the West's interests, and this is what everybody on that side thought was desirable. Suddenly, the whole message has changed, and that really is the first thing to come out of yesterday's meeting. The other thing, as you pointed out, really, is the extraordinary conjunction of the backdrop and the people who were in Notre Dame and the meetings that were taking place. And here we have a three-way meeting: Macron, Trump, and Zelensky. And they all seem to have got on absolutely fine. And Zelensky is talking about the possibility of diplomatic solutions. We all want to end this war as soon as possible and, quote, in a just way. Now, of course, you know, a just way, a just peace, that is to an extent in the eye of the beholder, and that is what will be the subject of negotiations as and when they happen. But I think there's been, in a way, some slight misunderstanding or misapprehension of the way Trump and Zelensky would interact, because before their first meeting, and this I think was their second, there was a sort of assumption that any settlement that Trump was involved in would favor the Russians. And this was because of the completely mistaken assumption that Trump is a bosom buddy of Putin. And therefore, because he was talking about ending the Ukraine war, that he was somehow anti-Ukraine. Now, I think that especially after their first meeting, but in general, you know, Zelensky is a very attractive, magnetic character, and he's got a cause, and the cause is the future and the independence of Ukraine. And I think that is the sort of thing that really appeals to Trump. And so the idea that that Trump would necessarily be favouring, as it were, a one-sided peace in favour of the Russians, I think that's been wrong from the beginning, but I think we can see how wrong it is now.
Just to say, the latest line is that Hezbollah has withdrawn all forces from Syria. This is the Hezbollah terrorist group, withdrawn all of its forces from Syria, according to 2 Lebanese security sources telling the Reuters news agency. The group pulled back its troops as rebel factions approached the capital of Damascus. One source saying that supervising forces Hezbollah had deployed to Syria overnight between Thursday and Friday had been sent to oversee the pullback. The lines are really coming in very rapidly on all of that. Mary, thank you so much for all your analysis today. You've certainly gone through quite a number of very thorny issues and decoded them, put them in English and made me understand them. I always learn so much when I speak to Mary Dejevsky, who's the foreign affairs columnist at the Independent.